My name is Mary Olson. I work for Nuclear Information and Resource Service, and I live in the southeastern United States as a field staff member of that national organization, www.nirs.org. And I wanted to include that website because on the day of the catastrophe, which was the day of the, I guess they backed down from 10.0 to 9.8 on the Richter scale, only one earthquake on Earth in recorded history exceeds what happened off the shore of Fukushima, which is in Chile, in the early 70s. I don't remember the exact date, but in modern times, this ranks as number 2 in terms of a seismic event. Off the Fukushima prefecture, where there are multiple nuclear power plant sites, all of which were impacted heavily by both the quake and the subsequent tsunami wave, which was enormous, 124-foot crest of that wave. I have not heard, even in conjecture, whether the rising tides of our planet due to climate change and warming of the oceans may have elevated that tsunami. I think that will be for later analysis, but I think, it's not impossible to tie all of these issues together as being related. The reactors came online in 1970, the first ones, and it's been a source of a little bit of forgiveness, a little bit of understanding, a little bit of compassion, nested into this horrible feeling of outrage that I have about this event. To remember that in 1970 I was a young college student and I took a class on radical theories. There were 3 radical theories presented. One was greenhouse gas climate impacts. One was major meteor, planetid type large object impacts, like what brought the dinosaurs down, we now understand. In 1970, those 2 were radical theories. And the third radical theory was continental drift. We didn't even have the words plate tectonics yet in the year that these nuclear power plants came online. So it helps me a little bit to be forgiving of the people who made these decisions to put nuclear power plants in this incredibly seismic zone, that it was a failure of reevaluation, that they didn't go back and reapply the new sciences to the old decisions and say, oh, golly gee, bad idea. The owners of the site have admitted that the earthquake damaged the reactors at Fukushima. There are 6 reactors there, but 3 of them had the fuel taken out. 2 of them more than a month before the fuel was transferred to fuel pools, and they have actually made it relatively okay. There has been some problems, but as far as we know, that fuel is intact. That's Unit 6 and 5. Unit 4 had only been defueled the week before for, they do maintenance and other operations. They take all the fuel out, put it in the pool. These particular reactors are GE Mark I, designed by General Electric, built primarily in conjunction with the Japanese in the post-Reconstruction period of Japan under military control of the United States during the 20 years that it took to build those reactors. So there are 6 there. They were refueling number 4. The very hot fuel was taken out just the week before. It was in the fuel pool. And these General Electric reactors have their fuel pool at 5 stories high in the air, above the reactor vessel, which is this incredibly robust steel and concrete structure down below. So, shake, rattle, and roll, 10.0, 9.8, whatever it was, comes through. Enormous amount of plumbing in these facilities. You have to lay every little pipe and tube end to end. You can cover from one coast of the United States to the other with how much plumbing is in these facilities. So you can imagine all that shaking and rattling, that pipes and other things. We now know that at least one of the containments and one of the fuel pools were cracked by the actual earthquake. So they were in trouble already. And then 20 minutes later, a tsunami, first the sea recedes, and then it comes back in full force. It's very possible that they lost cooling during the recession of the sea, but we don't know that. That's conjecture. And when the tsunami hit, it took out the off-site power. Most people would think that a power plant can power itself, that there would be, the ability for the power plant to run the pumps that cool it, to run the control room that the operators use. But that's not how these things are designed. They're designed to rely on power coming into the site from off, the grid. So the tsunami brings the grid down. There is at every reactor site backup power so that you can supply energy to run those pumps and run the control room. But that's run by diesel generators. And the tsunami engulfs the diesel generators and pulls their pumps out to sea. So the site now has zero power, no offsite power and no backup power. One day as the quake and the tsunami, Nuclear Information and Resource Service started a log. So if you ever want to read the story in sort of blog style of what happened on each day, Michael Marriott, who's the executive director, somebody I've worked with for 20 years now, undertook to sift through all the information. Initially it was just a trickle of information, and pretty quickly it became this maelstrom of all these news reports and all these different TV things and this expert and that expert, and all this massive information was flowing out. And he sifted through that and sort of put together what was the sort of critical path information in his view. It's just one view, but it's useful, and it's a very strong record of what unfolded. And what basically unfolded is we now know that the containments of 2 of the reactors were breached. One of the fuel pools was cracked. The fuel in that pool was extremely hot because it had just been loaded out of the reactor core, so it was essentially a reactor core outside of containment from just 1 week earlier. So it was a very, very unprecedented situation. There have been a number of major reactor accidents. You've perhaps heard of Chernobyl, which was an explosion and fire in 1 unit. 3 Mile Island was the melting of fuel in 1 unit that was far greater release than the government ever admitted to, but much smaller than this. There was the meltdown in Detroit that you probably never heard about at Fermi 1. There was a small meltdown in California and one on Long Island that you probably also never heard about, Santa Susana and at Brookhaven. In the 50s, there were massive accidents, one in Scotland where a reactor burned, military commercial reactor, sort of hybrid there, burned, called Windscale. And in the same year, an enormous tank of radioactive waste that was liquid exploded in the former Soviet Union. And so it's been about every 10 years that there's been a catastrophe in the nuclear world. We skipped the 90s, and that's another story, but probably due to the preventive work of Union of Concerned Scientists and my organization, we managed to forestall one. But Fukushima is unprecedented. 4 units in catastrophe. Conjecture now that the fuel is continuing to melt. That's not confirmed. But in any case, in units 1 and 2, the fuel has actually melted and dropped down into the bottom of containment. They're doing their best to keep liquid around it. Unit 3, there was a huge explosion. 1, 3, and 4 all exploded, but 3 was much larger explosion. If you look at the high-resolution photographs, little drones have been sent over by, it's called Cryptome, and they're posting these very high-resolution pictures, photographs that were taken from unpersoned aircraft flying over, taking photographs. And you can see that Unit 3 is absolutely decimated compared to 1 and 4. Half of the fuel pool, third to half, looks to be gone. The top of the reactor vessel looks to be gone. It's still conjecture at this juncture, but that a chemical explosion at that site compressed the fuel in the fuel pool. And that compression made a critical mass that lasted only for a fraction of a second, but long enough to detonate an actual nuclear explosion in Unit 3. It's a theory, not yet confirmed, but there's a lot of data that supports it. And if you actually look at the photographs of Unit 3 as it exploded, there was a red fireball that was not part of the other 2 that were simply gray, kind of flashes of white light and gray explosions. And in Unit 3, the fireball followed by black that actually makes a little mushroom cloud suggests that there was a relatively small fission explosion. And the other concern about that unit is that there have been fragments of this fuel, the very same fuel that we a little while ago talked about as a potential scenario for an accident transporting what we call highly radioactive waste. The exact same fuel was distributed in a several-mile radius. And that the only event during Fukushima that could have possibly done that so far is the explosion of the fuel pool of unit number 3. So they're not talking about that. There's not differentiation when they talk about the different reactor units in the news, in the various reports. They skip over 3. They just don't mention it. It's as if it didn't happen. But I truly believe that that is the source of most of what we're calling the hot particles. And a friend of mine, Marco Catalfin, is doing monitoring using devices that are very much like human lungs in Tokyo. Tokyo's only about 120 miles away. The city's already very contaminated. It's millions and millions of people. I've forgotten what the exact population is, but it's all of our cities combined practically in terms of density of population. And that area is contaminated. So Marco has this thing going. He also is using air filters from automobiles to figure out what is traveling by air. And he says that they're getting like 10 hot particles a day in Tokyo. This is maybe a month ago, so I'm not sure what they're getting now. And 5 in Seattle. So this distribution of the hot particles that were part of these fuel rods is pretty important for people to know that these events are global. That it's, you know, clearly burning coal is creating global impact. Clearly the climate crisis is a global impact of burning coal. But Chernobyl has had global impact. Fukushima is having global impact. Dirty energy just plain has to be substituted. And when people say, oh, you're just anti-nuclear, I say, oh no, I love nuclear power. I just like it 93 million miles away, because the sun is really where this type of activity belongs. Otherwise, you know, we're stuck trying to quote-unquote control something that clearly is beyond our ability. Fukushima is being managed, but it continues to emit radioactivity because every time they put water in, the water either runs out, in which case it's ending up in the ocean or in tanks and then in the ocean, or it's boiling off, in which case radioactive steam is going daily into the air because every day they have to add more liquid. And there's conjecture going on, and I'm sorry to use that word, but I haven't seen anything validating the idea, and it may just be that there's a blackout right now of clear information. But if the melting fuel continues to melt through containers, it can actually do what we call the China syndrome. And that is where the molten fuel, which is approaching the temperatures in the sun, not quite, but you know, hotter than anything else on the planet, cannot be contained by anything and gets itself down into the groundwater where it can cause flash steam explosions to occur. I looked at the webcam today. The facilities are still there, so we have not had, and there is a 24/7 webcam that TEPCO, the owner of the site, has put up, and it's somewhat reassuring to be able to look at those pictures and you know, feel like there's some ability for the rest of the world to monitor what's happening, even just visually. But there are independent monitoring going on. I'm going to add one more little piece, and then I'm going to stop, take questions. And the little piece is that they put a 12-kilometer, about 10-mile evacuation zone up, and they have expanded it out further, but the problem is that the explosion of Unit 3 and the other types of emissions are not, they don't follow the rules of a radius. And so there's areas that have plume deposition that's hotter, that's even out to 60 miles, that people should be evacuated because the levels are so high. But they're not inside the official evacuation zone, so they get no benefit from the government or from any insurance company if they choose to leave. And children are being allowed, you know, they're saying it's okay to operate schools with children getting radiation doses in Japan at the same level that nuclear workers get when they go to work at nuclear power plants. And of course the parents are protesting, and they're trying to work to get this changed and those levels reduced, and government support for evacuation of anybody who's living in these highly contaminated areas. But what's happening in the meantime is that mothers and children are leaving, and fathers are having to stay, continuing to work to be able to feed their families and pay bills and all that. And their houses are worthless. They're not going to be able to sell them to anyone ever. So it's really important for the world to join together. There's a petition out there for us supporting the Japanese government, including all these people who are being directly impacted.